Imagine a world where the most powerful symbol on earth isn't the cross, but a merchant ship. Imagine a global economy where the gold standard wasn't established in London or New York, but in the bustling ports of North Africa. We are living in a timeline dictated by a single choice made over 2,000 years ago on a dusty plain in Italy. Most people think of history as a series of names and dates, but the truth is that history is the ultimate ledger of profit and loss. And the biggest loss the world almost suffered was the total erasure of the Western world as we know it. Today, we are going to look at the ultimate counterfactual, how the victory of one man, Hannibal Barca, would have bankrupted the future of Christianity and fundamentally rewritten the rules of wealth and power that govern your life today. To understand the stakes, we have to talk about the greatest military disaster in history. In 216 BC, at the Battle of Cannae, the Roman Republic lost 80,000 men in a single afternoon. To put that in perspective for a modern audience, that's like losing the entire population of a mid-sized city in the time it takes to watch a football game. Rome was the startup of the ancient world, an aggressive, expanding firm that had bet everything on the conquest of the Mediterranean. Hannibal was the disruptor. He was the tactical genius who didn't just want to beat Rome, he wanted to liquidate it. And if he had marched on the city after Cannae, the Roman brand would have been deleted from the archives of history. But why does this matter to you? It matters because the Roman Empire was the essential hardware on which the software of Christianity was eventually installed. Think of Rome as the global operating system. They built the roads, which were the fiber optic cables of the ancient world. They established a unified currency and a legal framework that allowed for the movement of people and ideas across 3 continents. Without that infrastructure, the message of a small group of followers in Judea would have remained a local footnote. It would have lacked the distribution network needed to scale. If Hannibal wins, there is no Roman Empire to provide that platform. There is no Pax Romana to allow for safe travel. The product of Christianity would have never found its market. Instead of a centralized, bureaucratic empire that eventually merged with a single religion, a Carthaginian victory would have created a fragmented, mercantile world. Carthage was not interested in building a monolithic culture. They were interested in the bottom line. Their empire was a series of franchise agreements and trade outposts. They were the Phoenician version of a multinational corporation. In a world ruled by Carthage, pluralism wouldn't have been a social choice. It would have been a business necessity. We would have seen a patchwork of local gods and competing trade guilds with no central authority to enforce a single moral or religious code. The concept of the West, that unified cultural bloc that has dominated global finance for centuries, simply wouldn't exist. This brings us to a massive open loop in our history, the lost wealth of the Punic world. If Rome had fallen, the capital of the world would have stayed in the east and the south. The center of gravity for global trade wouldn't have shifted to the Atlantic. The discovery of the Americas might have happened under a different flag, or perhaps not at all, as the Punic traders preferred coastal routes to deep-sea exploration. Think about the massive institutional wealth of the Catholic Church. The art, the land, the banking systems, all of that capital would have been allocated differently. We might be looking at a world where the dominant financial centers are Tunis and Alexandria rather than London and Zurich. Now, let's look at the pattern interrupt in this historical flow. Many people assume that history is inevitable, that progress always leads to where we are now. But history is actually a series of fragile black swan events. The survival of Rome was a statistical anomaly. They were beaten, broken, and bankrupted, yet they refused to surrender. This stubbornness is what eventually led to the creation of the modern state. If Hannibal had finished the job, the very concept of citizenship, the idea that you have a stake in your government, would have been replaced by the Carthaginian model of mercenary loyalty. Imagine a world where your rights aren't guaranteed by a constitution, but by your employment contract with a merchant lord. If Christianity is erased from the timeline, we lose more than just a religion. We lose the moral framework that birthed modern capitalism. Max Weber famously argued that the Protestant work ethic was a primary driver of the Industrial Revolution. Even before that, the monastic systems of the Middle Ages were the first true corporations, managing vast estates and developing agricultural technologies that paved the way for modern industry. Without the church as a stabilizing financial institution during the Dark Ages, the capital of human knowledge might have been lost forever. We could still be living in a pre-industrial agrarian society, centuries behind our current technological curve. Consider the economic impact of the Crusades, the Renaissance, and the Reformation. These were massive movements of capital and labor triggered by religious tension and institutional growth. In a world without the cross, the Renaissance, which was largely funded by the church and wealthy Italian families whose fortunes were tied to the Roman system, never happens. The Medici family wouldn't have had a pope to influence. Leonardo da Vinci wouldn't have had the Sistine Chapel as a canvas. The aesthetic and intellectual dividends of the last 2,000 years would be entirely different. We would be looking at a world dominated by the aesthetics of the Levant and the merchant logic of the North African coast.
The financial implications of this shift are staggering. Rome's greatest export wasn't just grain or silk, it was law. Roman law is the foundation of the modern contract. Without the Roman legal system, the way we conduct business, own property, and settle disputes would be unrecognizable. Carthage relied on traditional Phoenician customs, which were far less formalized. In a Punic-dominated world, the cost of doing business would be much higher due to the lack of a standardized legal code. This could have stunted global growth for millennia. You wouldn't be checking your stock portfolio on an iPhone. You might be bartering grain in a local market under the watchful eye of a Carthaginian tax collector. Furthermore, the absence of the Christian framework would mean the absence of the university system. The first universities in Europe were ecclesiastical institutions. They were funded by the church to train administrators and theologians. Over time, these institutions became the incubators for the scientific revolution.
If you remove the church from the timeline, you remove the primary venture capitalist of the intellectual world. The timeline of human discovery would be pushed back by at least a millennium. We might still be waiting for the invention of the steam engine or the printing press. So, what is the takeaway for the modern investor and thinker? It is that stability is the greatest asset an economy can have. Rome provided a brutal but consistent stability for 500 years. That stability allowed for the accumulation of the cultural capital that eventually became the modern world. Hannibal, for all his genius, represented volatility. His victory would have been a victory for a decentralized, chaotic system of trade that prioritized short-term profit over long-term institutional building. We often talk about disruptive innovation as a purely positive force, but the Punic Wars show us the danger of disruption without a replacement. Hannibal could destroy the Roman system, but his own culture was not designed to replace it with a global governance model. As we look at the world today, we see a similar tension between centralized systems and decentralized disruptors. We see the rise of new empires in the digital space and the shifting of trade routes in real time. The lesson of Hannibal is that even the most powerful institutions can be brought to the brink of collapse by a single visionary leader. But the lesson of Rome is that the infrastructure you build is what ultimately determines your legacy. Rome survived because it was more than just a city. It was an idea with a built-in network effect. The world without the cross is a world that is wealthier in some ways, perhaps more diverse and less prone to monolithic religious warfare. But it is also a world that is fundamentally poorer in terms of the institutional and legal structures that allow for mass-scale human cooperation. We are the heirs of the Roman victory. Our currency,
our laws, and our very way of thinking about the future are all dividends from a war that ended over 2,000 years ago. When you look at a map of the world today, you aren't just looking at geography. You are looking at the remnants of a battlefield in Italy where the future of the human race was decided. Hannibal's elephants may have crossed the Alps, but they couldn't cross the Roman ledger. The Roman commitment to their social contract outlasted Hannibal's tactical brilliance. This is the ultimate lesson in the power of institutional resilience versus individual genius. If you found this deep dive into the hidden economics of history valuable, make sure you hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell. We're going to keep exploring the what-ifs that shape the financial landscape of the modern world. Because if you want to predict where the money is going next, you have to understand where it almost didn't go in the past. Every dollar in your pocket has a history that stretches back to the Punic Wars. Don't leave your financial future to chance. Learn the history of the game. Thanks for watching, and remember, in the game of history, the winner doesn't just get the gold. They get to write the ledger for everyone else.